like to introduce the head of Earl Page College, Kath Hunt, and invite Kath to welcome you all.
Thank you, Gemma, and thank you, Lewis. The Honourable Sarah Mitchell, MLC, Vice-Chancellor, Professor Bridget Haywood, Chancellor, Mr James Harris, Deputy Chancellor, Ms Jane McClellan, Emeritus Professor Graham Maddox, University Senior Executives, Heads of School and UNE personnel, Earl Page College residents and Senior Common Room members, UNE students and community members. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Earl Page College to the 35th Annual Politics Lecture. I am head of Earl Page College, and our college prides itself on its involvement with the wider community. As part of this commitment, the college is delighted to host an annual politics lecture as of major regional significance, to which many distinguished guests are invited. Tonight, of course, is no exception. This lecture series is held by the college in conjunction with the University of New England. This evening, there's a slight change in proceedings, and I owe a great deal of gratitude to our neighbouring college, Austin College, who've kindly allowed us to use their dining hall when our regular venue wasn't available. So thank you, Austin and Andrea. It's greatly appreciated. Earl Page College Politics Lecture attempts to balance a wide range of political thoughts, ideas and issues to promote a healthy debate on critically important matters to all who live in Australia and indeed far beyond our immediate borders. To formally introduce our guest speaker tonight, I'd like to welcome Emeritus Professor Graham Maddox. Professor Maddox is an acclaimed scholar, author, musician and conductor. His textbook, Australian Democracy in Theory and Practice, is one of the most highly regarded and widely used introductory politics textbooks in Australia. Professor Maddox has had a long association with the University of New England, spanning more than half a century when he joined the then Department of Continuing Education at Tamworth in 1965. In 1973, he joined the Department of Politics on the Armidale campus and served the university and broader community with great distinction and in various capacities, including a long tenure as Dean of Arts, a personal chair in politics, patron of the UNE Students' Union, President of the Australian Political Studies Association, Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and life member of Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge and the Centre of Theological Inquiry, Princeton University. It is a privilege to have Emeritus Professor Maddox join us once again this year. He's no stranger to this lecture, as guest speaker in 2003, and having chaired a number of our lectures with high-profile political speakers, including the Honourable Malcolm Fraser, John Howard, Tony Abbott, Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese. I ask that you please join me in welcoming Emeritus Professor Graham Maddox this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Kath, very much for that kind introduction. Mr Chancellor, Madam Vice-Chancellor, the Honourable Sarah Mitchell, Elder Colin Ahoy, the Honourable Adam Marshall, Deputy Mayor of Armidale and the Head of Earl Page College, members of Earl Page College, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, or as Robert Menzies once said in a reception for the Queen and her courtiers, prelates, potentates and princes. He was very epigrammatic. I'd like to add my welcome to you all to that of the Head of College, and it's my privilege to welcome Elder Colin Ahoy to give the welcome to country.
Thank you, Professor Maddox. Aboriginal people are the original custodians of the land. It is important that this unique position is recognised and incorporated as part of official protocol and events to enable the wider community to share in Aboriginal culture and heritage, facilitating better relationship between Aboriginal people and the wider community. Welcome to Country recognises the unique position of Aboriginal people in Australian culture and history. Today I stand here as a proud descendant of the Anouan people to welcome you to our land. I would like to pay respect to our elders both past and present, and on behalf of the Anouan people, the traditional custodians of the land on which this event takes place, welcome.
Thank you so much, Elder Ahoy. And we too pay our respects to the original custodians of this land and to their elders of past, present and those emerging, including, of course, Mr. Ahoy. This lecture commemorates the eponymous honoree of the college next door, Earl Page. This lecture was inaugurated originally as a joint enterprise between what was then the Department of Politics at the UNE and the Earl Page College. The department itself has gone through various transmogrifications and doesn't quite exist in that form anymore. Earl Page was the 11th Prime Minister of Australia. He was one of the founders of the Country Party in order to bring the voice of country people into the centres of power in Australia. He was a gentleman farmer and a doctor. I don't suppose his parents knew that he was going to be a doctor when they gave him the initials ECG. There was an old myth rolling around when I was young that said that Earl Page had been born early on Christmas morning, and his parents thought it would be over the top a bit much to call him early Christmas morning, so they put in the name of where he was born, Grafton, Earl Christmas Grafton Page. Well, that myth was utterly busted when I looked up the date of his birth, which was in fact last week, the 8th of August in 1880. I'm not inviting you now to count back the joyful months before the time of his birth to start any new myths. It's my great privilege to introduce the Honourable Sarah Mitchell, MLC, tonight as our very distinguished Earl Page lecturer. She's a distinguished member of Earl Page's Country Party, now called National Party after a significant national conference in Armidale, as it happened some years back. Ms Mitchell has been associated with the former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson in his electorate west of here and was working with him. And she is a former Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. She is now the Minister for Education and Early Childhood Development. And to my biased way of thinking, that is the most important position in the state government altogether. And in this regard, I also acknowledge our Deputy Chancellor, who was a very distinguished Director General of the Department of Education in New South Wales some years ago. I hope Minister Mitchell doesn't think it impertinent of me if I introduce her almost as a local girl. She comes from Gunnedah and lives in Gunnedah and is now going to deliver her lecture, which is going to enter us into the brave new world of digital science and education, called Facebook Fake News and Fear. Honourable Sarah Mitchell.
Thank you, Professor Maddox. I actually believe I did study your textbook when I was at university when Kath read that out, so it's lovely to have you introduce me. Well, good evening, everybody. Before I begin, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to elders past and present and emerging. And thank you, Uncle Colin, for your very kind words of welcome. As you mentioned in your remarks, Aboriginal people have been teaching and learning on these lands for tens of thousands of years, and it's great to see the University of New England continuing with that tradition. It's an incredible honour to have been asked to present the 35th Annual Earl Page College Politics Lecture to you tonight. It's the first time I've ever been invited to do anything like this, so I'm really proud and excited to be here with you all, and I really genuinely appreciate the opportunity. I want to start by taking you back. Imagine that you're living here in Australia at a time when there is no Facebook, no Netflix, no Spotify, no Insta stories and no smartphones. News comes in the form of a daily printed newspaper and the nightly bulletins on TV. And any news stories that you might see from the other side of the world are at the selection of the editors and the news producers and are not readily available to you in your pocket. If you need research materials for one of your uni assignments, you have to borrow the books from the library. If someone else has them out, you have to wait your turn to access the information that you seek. Most people still have home phones, automated vehicles are still the domain of science fiction movies, and Apple is only just starting to become more widely known as a tech company rather than as a piece of fruit. If I was to ask you what era you think I might be discussing or speaking about with these opening remarks, you'd be forgiven for assuming initially that perhaps I was talking about the 1950s or 60s, or at the very least sometime during the last century. In truth, I'm describing the year 2001, when I was a first-year student at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Everything that I described to you was the state of play back then. No iPhones, no streaming, actual written books and journals were used for our assignments, and frankly we were lucky if the bus down Anzac Parade in Sydney was even running, let alone automated. Compare that to right now, right here on the campus of UNE. Most of you would have a smartphone in your pocket. Hands up if you do. You've got a smartphone right now. Yep. Keep your hand up if you have some sort of social media presence. See, nearly all of us have smartphones. Some of us silly politicians have a couple. And most of us have multiple social media accounts across a range of domains. If I asked you to right now, you could look up the front page of today's New York Times while I'm speaking. There's now an automated bus being trialled here in Armidale. And Google is no longer just a company name, it has become a verb, and I know because I Googled it. To quote from one of the greatest movies of all time, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, life moves pretty fast, and if you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. The changes over the last 20 or so years in our society have really been extraordinary, but with change can also come fear and uncertainty. A child starting kindergarten this year will finish school in 2031. And when I hear that fact, I'm reminded of my eldest daughter, Annabelle. She's 6, and she's in kindergarten at Gunnedah South Public School, where I went to school, as did Adam, which was where we first met. But for these children, like the rest of us, how do we know what the future will look like? How do we know what skills that we need to prepare them with? How can we ensure that we're all going to be engaged global citizens in 2031 and beyond? These are some of the questions that, as Minister for Education and Early Childhood, I'm grappling with every day. And there are also questions that should be central to all of you in this room, to your educational journey and to your future careers. Everywhere that you look, technology is radically changing the status quo. In fact, things are changing so quickly that it's almost impossible to predict what the world will look like in 20 years' time. On one level, the technological revolution has made the world a far better place than it was 30 or 40 years ago. People have never been richer, they have never lived longer, and we have never been as scientifically accomplished as we are now. But being constantly surrounded by technology also brings its challenges. And one of the most prevalent of these challenges, particularly in your context as university students, is the effect that technology has had on critical thinking and indeed on knowledge more broadly. One of the primary purposes of both school and university is to equip students with the tools needed to separate valid knowledge claims from invalid ones, to separate the fake news from the real news, to understand which knowledge claims need to be critiqued and deconstructed and which ones do not. And the internet has made this exponentially harder to do. With the flood of information washing over you from social media, Google, Wikipedia, Reddit and other sources, it's harder for your generation to separate fact from fiction and true from false than anyone else who has gone before you. We seem to be witnessing in real time a Facebook-driven, Twitter-fueled breakdown of the long-standing division between professionals and laypersons, between teachers and students, between those with achievement in an area and those with none. This is because the internet has allowed people to mimic intellectual accomplishment by indulging in an illusion of expertise fed by a limitless supply of facts. Any person with a social media presence can latch onto these facts and use them to present their opinion on a matter as a valid knowledge claim to their followers. And some of these people, whether they be celebrities, politicians, bloggers or Instagram stars, have such large followings that their often bizarre beliefs are circulated around the various echo chambers that exist online until they are so widely disseminated that the general public begin to believe them as fact. Before you know it, you have a fake news story that is more commonly believed than the truth. And to give you some examples, this is why at one point, almost 40% of Americans believed that former President Barack Obama was not an American citizen by birth. It's why a significant number of people still believe that vaccines can cause autism, despite mountains of scientific evidence to the contrary, or why, unbelievably, a large number of people believe that we faked the moon landings. I'm sure everyone in this room has come across misinformation online. We all have experience with it. And sometimes it's very obvious, but other times it can be more subtle. The lines can be blurred when fact and fiction combine online. And sometimes stereotypes are presented to you as absolute truths, and all of us have a tendency to believe what we see. I'll give you another example. In preparing for this lecture tonight, I Googled images of National Party MPs. And it probably won't surprise you when I say that the first 30 or so photos that came up were of middle-aged white men in suits or RMs and chinos, all looking very rural and agricultural. A few more clicks and I came across some links to our country party roots, including the influential and important figure in our party's history and the namesake of your very college, Sir Earl Page. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with fitting the description of a rural middle-aged bloke, and in truth, that probably does describe the majority of my parliamentary colleagues. As Nats, we are proud to represent our farmers and our country communities, but Google Images didn't show the full picture, and it doesn't encapsulate us all. I don't fit that mould. I'm 37, I'm a female from Gunnedah, born and raised, married with 2 girls. My parents are not farmers, they were small business owners when I was growing up. I've never lived on a farm, and I have to say, probably the only National Party politician in history, I've never owned a pair of R.M. Williams boots. But I love where I live, and I'm really passionate about fighting for a fair share for services and investment in regional New South Wales. I've been a member of our party for nearly 15 years. I've been a member of Parliament for 8 years. I was selected to represent the Nats in State Parliament as a 28-year-old female. If I'd believed the stereotype, I would never ever have thought that the Nationals were the party for me, but it's exactly where I belong. And the same can be said of a lot of my colleagues. I don't want to embarrass him, but Adam, sitting here in the front row. Adam first entered political life as a very young mayor in Gunnedah. 19, I think he was, youngest ever mayor in the history of our town. He got involved, stood up, had a go, and his career has skyrocketed since then, and the contribution that he has made has been and will continue to be outstanding. A colleague of mine in the upper house by the name of Brawny, current Minister for Women and Mental Health. She was one of the first McGrath nurses and worked in cancer services for over 20 years. Born and raised overseas with a family father who worked for Qantas. Gurmesh Singh, our new member for Coffs Harbour. Someone with an IT background from an Indian Sikh family who has been a blueberry farmer in most recent times. And even our leader in New South Wales, John Barilaro, who proudly calls himself the Italian chippy from Queanbeyan, because that's exactly what he is. Geography is what's important to our party. Sticking up for the regions is what we care about, not ideology. So you have to go beyond the immediate assumption of who we are to find the truth that lies behind the facade. Things have changed in the Nats like they have within our society, and I like to think of us as the new Nats. Like everything, political parties can change and adapt and evolve over time. But in many ways, Google still has us stuck in the assumed stereotype. Now, don't get me wrong, I do think that the internet is a tremendous educational asset. It is absolutely central to productivity and connectivity in the 21st century. There are hundreds of millions of websites, including those home to very reputable publications, that have in many ways made teaching, study and research easier than it has ever been. The problem is that to find these valid knowledge sources, you have to navigate through what can sometimes be an endless ocean of misleading garbage posted by everyone from a well-intentioned grandmother to a conspiracy theorist to a Twitter troll. There are also some amazing people to follow on Twitter. My personal favourite are many of the astronauts. Amazing insights and, if you pardon what I'll call the mum joke, photos that are literally out of this world. I'm also fairly chuffed that Little Britain star and acclaimed children's author David Walliams follows me on Twitter. I think it's probably more a case of a mistaken click of a mouse rather than a genuine interest, but hey, I'll still take it. And it's certainly the case that some of the smartest and the most fascinating people in the world are now more accessible to all of us than ever before, and many of them have a significant presence online. However, some of the stupidest people also reside just one click away. For educational purposes then, the internet does little good if people have never been taught how to judge the validity of information or the reputability of an author. As young people, we need to make sure that we equip you with the tools to do this from a really early age, so as to maximise the educational opportunity of the internet while minimising its potential for harm. Once you have these tools, it's up to you. The world and all its information becomes your oyster, but you still have to make sure you avoid the grit. Don't always believe everything you read or all the clickbait that you follow. Think critically. Go out of your way to look outside of your own echo chamber. All of us are guilty of only reading and subscribing to people that we like, following those that we look up to, things we already agree with. But if all we ever do is read news or opinions that are filtered to us by who we choose to follow on our social media feeds, we end up slapping each other on the back, congratulating ourselves on how right our opinions are, while writing off anyone who might hold a different point of view as being uninformed or ignorant and wrong. There's no better place to expand your knowledge or to challenge your preconceived ideas than right here at university. You should go to university to be confronted and to have your outlook challenged. That is one of the reasons why you are here. Universities should not be spaces where you go to have your pre-existing opinions validated by an echo chamber. At an intellectual level, you need to have the constitution to cope with hearing views that you might find confronting or even offensive, or that you fundamentally disagree with. Because real critical thinkers engage openly. They don't reject ideas out of hand because they've made a judgment about the person giving them. So how do you navigate things going forward? Well, you need to become well-educated young adults with the capacity to think critically, and you need to engage. When it comes to politics, become engaged. Don't rely on Q&A or the snippets of question time that you might see on the nightly news, and don't rely on social media alone. Form your own opinions. When the next elections roll around, I have a challenge for all of you. Think about the issue that matters most to you. It might relate to water policy or education or health or the environment. Whatever it may be, you should investigate it, research it, email your local MP and the candidates, or take the time to call them. Get the facts and then make up your own mind about whose position best aligns with your views and your values. Now, I would obviously hope for many of you in this room it would be the Nationals, but I promise there's no coercion here at all. But in all seriousness, knowledge is power, and being informed and a participant in our democracy is a beautiful thing. When you go to vote, be informed, even if it's only in one policy area that matters to you. Citizens in other nations around the world would kill to have the right to vote, and many have lost their lives to the cause. Take it seriously, because democracy matters. And I would also add that you should never let your youth stop you from contributing. If you're interested in politics, get involved. Join a political party of whatever colour or flavour entices you. Run for a position here at the university or in local government or state or federal politics. Make a contribution. And throughout your life, you may find that your opinions on things will change. And that's okay, it's healthy. Life experiences will shape your views. To give an example from my own life, I have two girls, Annabelle, who I mentioned earlier, who's 6, and Matilda, who is almost 2. And when I was pregnant with Annabelle, I knew that we would have to send her to daycare a couple of days a week. But as a working mother, I felt really guilty about that. I thought maybe I was putting my needs before her, and it was a very conflicting decision for us to make. Fast forward to now, where both my girls are a little bit older. They attend a really great daycare service in Gunnedah, and I don't feel guilty anymore. I've realised that my girls have enjoyed making friends at daycare. They've bonded with their educators, and they've had some wonderful experiences. And with my ministerial hat on as early childhood minister, I know that the cognitive, emotional and social skills that they develop by attending a quality early childhood service in their formative years sets them up for life. 90% of brain development happens before the age of 5. So it's great for me as a parent to see them engaged in play-based learning because it matters. And I know that for our family, we've made the right decision to go down that path. And I also know that as a woman, wanting to balance life as a mum and a wife and to have this position in my career is something that I should be proud of and not something that I should feel guilty about. I've also learnt to take my hat off to stay-at-home mums because that job is tough. And ultimately what it's about is that we shouldn't judge other people. We should make our own decisions about what is best for us and our families and support each other in the choices that we make and not be afraid to change our minds or our perceptions. My challenge to you all is just that. Shed your preconceived notions. Don't be afraid to be open-minded. Because ultimately the best way to distinguish between fake news and real news, between fact and fiction, is a commitment to lifelong learning. A commitment to building your knowledge base. Learning never stops, and it should never stop. A few weeks ago I was down in Tamworth and speaking to some of the Year 6 students at Tamworth Public School, and one of them asked me if my job was hard. And the short answer was yes. Some days it really is. As Minister, I oversee one of the biggest public school systems in the world. If the New South Wales Department of Education was taken out of Australia and transplanted over to the United States, only New York would be bigger than New South Wales. We have 2,200 public schools, 65,000 teachers, 800,000 students, as well as 700 community preschools and managing those transitions to and from school. It's my job to help deliver 190 new and upgraded school projects, reviews into the curriculum and NAPLAN, and also helping students and teachers manage increasingly complex lives. It's not easy, but it's rewarding, and I never stop learning. I was at a primary school in Dubbo not long ago, and I visited the Year 4 class, and they taught me a way to distinguish between African and Asian elephants that I'd never heard before. For the record, it's all to do with their toenails. African elephants have 4 toenails on the front feet and 3 on their back, whereas Asian elephants have 5 toenails on their front feet and 4 on the back. True story. Hand on Hurt learnt something new that day by being in Class 4W in Dubbo. Because learning is important and it should always be key to your future successes, and a solid education must be your foundation. And it is interesting that despite all the radical change brought by technology, the fundamental role of education hasn't changed. It is still relational. Yes, people can now do degrees online. They can now talk via FaceTime to their tutors. My husband Anthony did his entire MBA through the University of South Australia without ever stepping foot on campus. But education is still about the transference of knowledge from one person to another. It's still about equipping people with the tools that they need to understand the world around them and determine right from wrong. We undoubtedly live in exciting times, and I don't want you to think that anything I've said tonight means that we should be scared about the future. When I think about the kindergarten kids this year, who will be our class of 2031, I'm excited for them. As Minister for Education, I don't want to hear commentators encourage teachers to impose a fatalist mindset upon our children. Rather than embracing the future, sometimes the rationale is that students should be protected from it, that they should be taught technological advancement will, if unchecked, limit their future employment opportunities. Nothing is further from the truth. While it is undoubtedly true that AI will replace some jobs into the future, these jobs will in turn be replaced by other jobs that need a different skill set. And these are some of the issues that we are grappling with right now for myself as Minister and within the Department of Education. And there's 2 specific programs that we've been working on. Firstly, we have the Catalyst Lab, which is all about working with our teachers who are in our classrooms every day to decide the best ways to prepare children for the ethical and moral dilemmas they will no doubt face in the future. Just last week, during Education Week, we ran something called the Game Changer Challenge, where schools from across the state participated in events that were all about answering the question, how do we humanise technology? I was fortunate to spend some time with the students and a panel of experts where we talked about what we thought the answers might be. And yes, we talked about one day having robot politicians and maybe living under the sea. There were some primary school kids there, so they were the kind of cool things that we contemplated. But the main agreement from everybody was that the next great invention on par with electricity was artificial intelligence. However, there was also a clear response from everyone in the room that even in a world dominated by AI and technology, there will always be an unprecedented demand for those with relational skills, for those that understand the complex interplay between technology and society. The most successful tech companies are not simply those that build the fastest computer chips. They are those that understand this interplay. When discussing Apple's success, Steve Jobs said that it is in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It is technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanities, which yields us the results that makes our hearts sing. Similarly, Mark Zuckerberg insists that Facebook's continuing development is informed as much by psychology and sociology as it is by programming. History is littered with futurists mistakenly claiming that technology will eliminate our employment opportunities. In the depression-beset 1930s, we were repeatedly warned that robots would decimate factory jobs. John Maynard Keynes, no less, forecast that technological progress might allow a 15-hour workweek and abundant leisure by 2030. Wouldn't that be nice? If history is anything to go by, in 20 years' time, the current predictions that all jobs will have disappeared will no doubt look equally preposterous. Evidence already suggests that if you are a teacher, a doctor, a nurse, a farmer, a psychologist, a counsellor, you can rest easy knowing that there will be an unprecedented surge in demand for your services. Despite not being a scientist, engineer or tech guru, you will be needed more than you ever have been before, because real people will always matter more than Facebook or fake news or fear. In closing, I leave you with this message. You live in an amazing world at an amazing time. You are receiving a world-class education at a fantastic university in one of the most beautiful regional cities in the nation. Embrace the opportunity. Think critically. Challenge existing orthodoxies. In 10 or 15 times, you lot will be running the joint. It's becoming clear that we are racing towards a future with immense potential to drive productivity and improve standards of living to levels unfathomable just a generation ago. So whether it's environmental restoration, transitioning to renewable energy, medical advances, space exploration, or improving road safety, resolving the great challenges of our time will rely on all of you simultaneously embracing cutting-edge technology while also retaining a capacity to think critically. And I have no doubt that you will be able to do both. Thank you.
It's now my privilege to introduce Professor Bridget Haywood, the Vice-Chancellor of the University. Professor Haywood has a very distinguished career in academia, having worked in the United Kingdom, New Zealand and Australia itself. She comes to us from the University of Tasmania, but there's a string of achievements in front of that before she came to Australia. She was engaged with two very experimental universities in the United Kingdom, the Open University and Keele University, both of which were very innovative in their time with new curriculums and new styles of delivering education to people. She was appointed a professor at the tender age of 33, and but they're both tender. And she's a great scholar of inorganic chemistry and has a great success as a promoter of research innovation in our universities. She is also committed to opening up the best opportunities for our students to make progress at university. I hope it's not presumptuous of me, since Professor Haywood has been here for a couple of weeks, to welcome her to the University of New England, at least on behalf of all those of us like me who are only meeting her today for the first time. Professor Haywood, the warmest of welcomes, and would you please deliver a vote of thanks to our distinguished speaker.
Students of the University of New England, representatives from country, representatives from community, Chancellor, Pro-Chancellor, academic colleagues. This is one of my first speeches on behalf of the university, and I think it's incredibly fitting that it's at a venue where we're discussing the value of education. This university was founded a number of years ago. It's slightly older than me, but not much, on the premise that we should offer as much or as little education to those who can make need of it. And it recognised that Australia, in the middle of the last century, needed a workforce that was fit for purpose. It needed to provide opportunity to those who perhaps were not able to visit the large cities, to those who had arrived in Australia escaping from difficult times elsewhere. To the point the Minister has already made, we could be describing Australia of today, the modern Australia. Australia needs a workforce that is educated. Australia needs to ensure that each of its citizens can participate in community, make a contribution to nation, be part of families that are successful, and be part of communities where their offerings are valued and where the communities are purposeful and successful. I think it's amazing that one of the first regional universities is still today a powerful and effective voice in and for Australia. But more important than that, that we're still having a conversation. We're still part of a conversation for Australia, and indeed for the world, about what is the value of education and how should education opportunities be realised. In the Minister's speech this evening, she's talked about the transition of technology. In my language, it's the journey from Abacus to iPhone. It's affected all of our lives. There are many of us here who remember using a slide rule. I'm one of them. I am that old. Today, I quite happily use 3 or 4 telephones, one to use messages, one to search information, and one to keep me in contact with the rest of the world. Today, I had messages from 5 different countries, from 3 different colleagues, sharing information. I'm like most people. I was born just after the introduction of the penny black. This university was founded on the opportunity to share information using postage. Now, to the point made, we share it with fast broadband, we share it by satellite technologies, and we share and engage with the transition of information, which we have to challenge. Fake news, I think, has always existed. I think what stands now is the ability for us all to be more critical of what fake news is about, to be more critical of what are the key elements of a good quality education, rather than merely the transmission of information. I think it's really important that this university continues to stand tall in a conversation about the value of education, its purpose, and the methodologies for delivering it. Just over a month ago, 2.8 million people descended on New York from 37 different countries around the world across an age span of 82 to 12. They all turned up to play the game Fortnite or watch people playing Fortnite. To me, that is incomprehensible. But I would argue, for the benefit of the Minister and for the benefit of Australia, that the textbook is no longer the instrument of learning that it used to be. We're all overly excited about the possible power of a tablet, an Android or a smartphone or some other fruit-based device to assist us in delivering a form of information that Socrates, I think, took the copyright on many centuries ago. So, Minister, I think you have challenged us to be critical in our use of information. I think you have challenged us to be aware of the value of technology as it paces through each generation and their ability to participate in education. But, Minister, I would challenge you and your portfolio, and I would challenge the New South Wales Government to be aware that Australia should lead, not follow. And whether it's Fortnite in education terms, so UNE students look out, I am planning to have Fortnite running in the library next week, for pedagogic purposes, my concern on behalf of the future education of young Australians, and I'm one of them, I'm a young Australian, I would be concerned, and I welcome your participation here today, that we must not just be satisfied with the opportunities that education brings us, but we must equally challenge ourselves to offer the very best education for the future. You've talked about some of the values today. I would challenge Australia to be aware that the whole education process is changing and that we at this university would be like to be part of your conversation about valued education for the future. We very much appreciate the generosity of your time, your wisdom and your words this evening. Colleagues from the University of New England, please thank our speaker.